The invasion was just because, you know, it was getting to the point where the military, first of all, they'd basically done their job. The military was told right at the beginning, don't leave. And they were told it in a way which everyone understood. The way they were told was, do your job, do it as long as you want. When we tell you it's enough, stop, and then you'll live in luxury for the rest of your life. That's basically what they were told. Well, you know, under those conditions, why should they leave? You know? I mean, they were essentially told, look, when it's over and we tell you to go, you'll go, and we'll either put you on a jet and send you off to France like we did with Duvalier, and you can take half what's left of the treasury in your pocket, or else we'll allow you to live up in Pétionville and wait around a couple of months, and then we'll set it up so you can run for office and win like we just did with Riosmont. I mean, why should they leave? You know? So they didn't leave. It finally got to be a bit of an annoyance. For one thing, the military was beginning to cut into the interests. See, you know, these military thugs have a way of getting too big for their britches. They start cutting in on the interests of the moderate sector of the business community. That's another technical term. Moderate sector means the guys who don't think you just ought to slaughter everyone and torture them and rape them and so on. Rather, you ought to save them so that they can work for 5 cents an hour in an assembly plant. That's the moderate sector. And these guys were beginning to cut in on the interests of the moderate sector. Like, you know, they were cutting in on their monopolies, and they were making too much money, and, you know, they were weakening their power and so on. So, you know, you got to tell them to go. Okay, they told them to go. That's what's called the invasion. If they wanted them to go, they could have told them 3 years ago.
What's your opinion about effects of major organized religions on human rights, economy, and level of education of today's society? Is it a coincidence that most of the left wing supports the molested priests, you know, and
They support the what?
Support the priests and church and religious, you know, Iran, and
it's not
is there
true.
a coincidence that most of the fundamentalists are poor people? And this was the second fault of view that I've been witnessed, and I'm intentionally avoiding talking about this for did I miss it?
Well, I mean, no, I'm not intentionally avoiding it. It's a very important phenomenon. For example, in Central America in the last, you know, the left, I don't exactly know what the term means, but if the left refers to people who are interested in stuff like freedom and justice and human rights and all that kind of junk, let's mean by that the left. If that's what the left is, they don't have any view about religion, because religion is all over the place, you know. So like religion, take say Haiti, religion is Aristide, and religion is the papal nuncio, who's, you know, the biggest supporter of the coup, you know. I mean, the Vatican's role in this is grotesque. It's the only, it's not a nation, but it's the only international entity that's even recognized the coup regime. And that's typical, you know, religion's everywhere. You can't make a comment about it. You can't say, what do you think about the Haitian church? You have to ask which Haitian church. You know, the priests and the nuns who are working in the rural areas, and, you know, the occasional bishop. Romulus is one bishop. Or do you mean the guys who were put in on a Lateran pact, you know, a pact modeled on Mussolini's pact with the Vatican between Duvalier and the church, which put in big supporters of the Tonton Macoute and the rest of them in power, and are still backed by the Vatican? Which church are you talking about? And the same is true everywhere. In Latin America, for example, where the Catholic Church has been very strong forever, for a long time it was the church of the rich and the powerful. And in the 50s and the 60s, that began to change. And it was a dramatic change. I mean, the bishops' conferences since Medellin and Puebla back in the 60s and 70s, they just, you know, mostly had to do with Pope John XXIII at an official level, but, you know, at a lower level, it just had to do with all kinds of activism that was going on with worker priests and nuns working with the poor and all sorts of stuff. I mean, out of all of this came the thing that's called liberation theology, if you want a name, and that became a major force in the Latin American church. Well, it's not by any means the only force, you know, but it was strong enough so that the U.S. had to go to war with it, We literally went to war with the church. I mean, the war in the 1980s in Central America was very much against the church. Again, that's something that has to be suppressed here, but it's quite obviously true. It was kind of symbolic, just to look at what happened. I mean, the big, monstrous attacks began pretty much, the ones that the U.S. was backing, with the assassination of the Archbishop in El Salvador. And they ended, the biggest one that ended was with the murder of 7 Jesuit intellectuals and a couple other people in November 1989. That's the decade. Starts with the assassination of the Archbishop, ends with the murder of the Jesuit intellectuals, all by our guys. Happened to be Carter in the first place, and with Reagan, I guess, still in the second, or maybe Bush, I forget. But and that was what was going on in between. I mean, the church really got it in the neck. And it's because they were on the wrong side. They were on the side of the population. They were pursuing the preferential option for the poor, so they had to be destroyed like anybody else does who works for poor people. The United States has no special, the U.S. policymakers have no particular attitude about religion any more than the left does. The question is what religion is doing. Now let's say take Islamic fundamentalism. One of the current myths is that the U.S. is supposed to be worried about Islamic fundamentalism. I mean, just take a look at the world and ask yourself how well that holds up. The leading Islamic fundamentalist state in the world is Saudi Arabia. Are we worried about Saudi Arabia? No. Biggest friend. Why? Because the gangsters who run Saudi Arabia are doing their job. Their job is to make sure that to manage the oil wealth in such a way that the profits go to the West and not to the people of the region. And as long as they do that job, they can be as brutal and as religious fanatics and anything else they like. That kind of Islamic fundamentalism is fine. Go to non-state actors, non-state fundamentalists. Well, the most extreme Islamic fundamentalist, I guess, in the world was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in Afghanistan, who got $6 billion approximately from the U.S. and our Islamic fundamentalist friends in Saudi Arabia through the 80s. He's a mad Islamic fundamentalist, more extreme than anybody can dream of. He's also a major terrorist and narco-trafficker. The U.S. was pouring money at him. He's now tearing the country apart. He's killing thousands or maybe tens of thousands of people. He's destroyed Kabul and so on. Nobody ever reports it because it's our guy. So he's an okay Islamic fundamentalist. I mean, now we don't like him anymore because he's got Stinger missiles and he's probably giving them to all his friends and they'll start shooting down airliners and that sort of thing. But, as long as he was working for us, he was a good Islamic fundamentalist. He's working against us, he's a bad Islamic fundamentalist. And the same is true of secular nationalists and priests and, anybody. The question is which side are they on, not what do they believe in. So there's nothing general to say about religion. You can talk about particular things which are different. As to why the poor are going to fundamentalist movements around the world, that's not an accident. Like you say, it's very good reasons for it. The reasons are that the secular alternatives have been destroyed. So take, say, the Arab world. I mean, secular nationalism and other secular movements have simply been destroyed. Sometimes by outside force, sometimes by internal factors. But whatever the reasons, they're pretty much gone. And if you're living in the Cairo slums, let's say, which means, like 90% of the people of Egypt, and, your kid is dying from some sickness, there's only one place you can go for medical aid, and that's the Islamic fundamentalists. They run clinics. They have free doctors who do things. They provide social services and so on. The government is for the rich. That's why we like it. But if you're among the poor, they're not going to do anything for you. And as a result, the fundamentalist movements do organize among the poor. They also offer people something culturally and psychologically, kind of like a vision. Maybe it's a crazy vision, whatever you think about it, it's something. It's something you can be committed to, some kind of hope for the future, some way of working with other people, whatever. I mean, a lot of ugly aspects, but that's, but it's, you look across the board, you can see why it's working. Kind of the same reason why Farrakhan is having a lot of success here. Whatever you think about him, they're offering something to people. Nobody else is. Since the U.S., and in fact it's not just us, like anyone with any power, is going to try to block any constructive initiatives that will cut into that power, what you're left with is the things that somehow can survive, and they grow out of popular soil typically. And right now they happen to be taking fundamentalist forms. I mean, just a last comment on fundamentalism. The United States itself is one of the most fundamentalist countries in the world. I mean, by comparative standards, we rank around Iran, literally, in terms of people's beliefs and, religious fanaticism and stuff like that. We're very different from any industrial country. Now, there's another one that comes close. So, this is an extreme fundamentalist country, and there's all kind of speculations as to about why that's true, but part of the reason may well be, as a lot of political scientists have thought, that it reflects the absence of democratic institutions. I mean, we have formal democratic institutions, but the population knows they don't work. Half the population in the country thinks that the system is so corrupt that both political parties ought to be simply disbanded. Well, okay, you got half the population thinking there is no political system at all. It's going to be a big impetus to look for something else. And one of the things that people we don't have functioning organizations that enable people to get involved in the political arena, like unions, for example, or political clubs or things like that. It's a business-run society. It has, to a large extent, succeeded in imposing kind of like a business ideology, gain wealth, forget about everybody else. When people react to that in various ways, and one of the ways they react is religious fundamentalism. This is a very different country from, say, the Cairo slums, but some of the dynamism is similar, I think. So I think it's a proper question, an intriguing and complicated matter, but has a lot of different facets to it.
Quick question, Professor. The first part has to do with the mainstream press warning about this new book by Hugh Pearson called Shadow of the Panther, talking about the vice and corruption in the Black Panther Party movement. There is no talk of the Chicago police and police around the country going after the Panthers and the FBI. I would like to know if you can comment on that. And second, the Urban League has put forth a new platform along the lines of bootstrap capitalism, Liberty Washington nonsense.
I'm sorry, Ken. I didn't hear the last part.
Bootstrap capitalism, saying that we have to do the kind of things that Farrakhan talks about, take care of our own, get into businesses. Do you think the way to success and black emancipation is for black people to become the heads of IBM and General Motors? Thank you.
Well, on the first part, that's an old story. Actually, I had a lot of personal experience with that, it turns out. I was with a group that was a resistance sport group that was maybe the first white group, or one of the first white groups, to get involved with the Panthers back in the 60s, just when they were getting started. And so I had a lot of personal experience. Actually, I was at Fred Hampton's funeral, the guy who was murdered in Chicago, one of the very few white faces there, in fact. But what you describe, what you allude to, Tom described, is exactly right. I mean, the Panthers were they were an important. There weren't a lot of people. They have big publicity, but not many people. By now, we have a ton of IBF stuff, FBI stuff on them, and according to the FBI, there were about 800 members, and they were, the FBI devoted huge resources to destroying them, because these 800 people might actually do something. And the way they went after them was pretty selective. I mean, the Panthers, all you had to do was to just begin to have contacts with them. You could see right off it's a very diverse group. I mean, it involved everything from thugs and criminals who were using this as a kind of rip-off technique to very constructive and serious organizers. If you ask who survived, it's the thugs and criminals. The serious organizers were killed or eliminated in some fashion or other, and the extreme example is Fred Hampton, who you're referring to. I mean, Fred Hampton is a really important case in modern American history. This is a black organizer who the FBI tried to get assassinated very hard. The first way they did it, all the records are out on this, completely public, it's been public for 20 years. He was the most constructive and effective Panther organizer in the ghettos. Non-violent, no violence, no drugs, nothing, just doing much worse things, organizing people. The way they tried to get at him at first was by working through a criminal gang. There was a criminal gang in Chicago ghetto called the Blackstone Rangers. Now, the security forces like the police and FBI, they don't have anything against criminal gangs. That's their part of the technique for controlling the ghetto, so they're okay. And the FBI was all involved with the Rangers, of course. And they sent a letter it was kind of like comical, fake black dialect, written by some guy sitting in a Washington office, dear brother or something or other. I mean, it's comic. You've seen it, I'm sure. It's comical to read, saying, that there's this guy, Fred Hampton, and he's taken out a contract on you, written to Jeff Ford or whoever it was who was the head of the Rangers. The idea was to try to get the Blackstone Rangers to assassinate Fred Hampton for him. Okay, the Rangers and the Panthers were already enough integrated with one another, so they, first of all, nobody in the black community could have believed this letter for a second, but secondly, they had good relations, and it didn't work. So the next thing the FBI did was simply set up a Gestapo-style assassination, literally. I mean, they managed to get an FBI infiltrator to be the Fred Hampton's main security guy. He and a bunch of other Panthers were living in an apartment. They sent the Chicago police a completely faked, claim, the FBI report that these guys had guns and this and that and the other thing, and they got the police to break in at 4 o'clock in the morning and just murder them in bed, probably drugged. There was at first kind of like a pretense that the Panthers had fired and this and that and the other thing, but that all blew apart. And they finally had to concede what was true. It was just a straight Gestapo-style assassination. Okay? I mean, of all the crimes in the Richard Nixon era, there isn't one domestic one. I mean, I'm forgetting the internationals. There's not one domestic one that even comes close to this. I mean, compared with this, Watergate isn't even a Tea Party. It doesn't even exist. This is part of a program that goes way back. Goes back to the late 50s. Kennedy built it up a lot. Continued through Johnson. Nixon extended it. Technically, it's supposed to have terminated in 1975 when it was exposed, but nobody knows. It's just nobody's investigated since then. Well, okay, that's and that's the selective. And the Panthers were destroyed, but it wasn't just the Panthers. I think the whole black community was just devastated. There were all sorts of things going on in the 60s, and they were treated kind of like the Haitian popular movement. I mean, they can kill 4,000 people because this is the United States, not Haiti, but similar. It's kind of like the similarity between death squads that murder children in Brazil and the way we take care of them here. Rich countries, you do it differently. But sometimes it went down to straight murder, like in the Hampton case. Well, okay, that's, no more Panthers. There's another part to that question, Jeffrey. Oh, yeah. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, it's extremely hard to think what way there is out of... I mean, it happens that there's a very close correlation between race and class in the United States. I mean, across the board, blacks and Hispanics and so on are worse off. But nevertheless, there is a good correlation, and fundamentally, it's a class issue, and those are tough. It would be no easier to answer the question how white working people can do something about their lives. I mean, it's just a big, it really means that the one-sided class war that's been going on for a long time has to become a two-sided class war. I mean, the business classes have never had any illusion about this. They are very class conscious. They have always understood that they're involved in a very tough and brutal class war. And they've succeeded in demolishing the opposition, scattering them. And if that goes on, they'll win. Simple as that. I don't think that you can get black capitalism to compete with IBM. That's outlandish. There aren't any resources there. But exactly the way to change this, I don't think it can be done within the black community any more than Mexican workers can resist transnationals. Together with U.S. workers, they can probably do something, but not alone. And together with the rest of, the big majority of the American population that's being ground down, the black sector, which has special problems of its own, can do something. But alone, I don't think there's much they can do. So I don't see any real answers in that narrow framework. I mean, it takes the kind of solidarity that crosses ethnic lines. Actually, that's something that the union movement did have. So you go back, say, 100 years, and the ethnic hostilities within the white community were not, often even more rabid than the hatred of blacks, like, the hatred for what they called Huns, which meant almost anybody from Eastern Europe, in white working class areas was grotesque, or Irish, let's say. They treat them just like, worst possible. Like, just to give you one example, a gynecological surgery was developed in the 19th century by very respected doctors. You'll see their pictures up in the medical school. And the way they managed to do it was because they had people to work on, namely Irish indigent women and slaves, black women, slaves. And they treated them the same way. They'd take somebody and do 30 experiments in a row on them until they were torn to shreds and so on. Kind of like Mangala, basically. And they didn't make much of a difference, as far as I can see, between Irish women and black women. The one was technically white. And the reason is these are basically class issues. Well, if you look at the, let's say, labor history, like at the Homestead strike, big strike in 1892, when steel workers essentially took over a town and kind of ran the industry and so on, or finally smashed up by the army, that is the first time that it overcame the ethnic hostilities. There wasn't any more beating up on the Huns, because they were now part of it. They were all part of it. And that's happened in union organizing, and it's happened throughout the years. It happened in the formation of the CIO. It's happened in other activities where people were really working on something together, and they saw that their real interests were basically common. But outside of that, you can't do it, as far as I know.
I don't want to blindside you with this next question. I want to ask you first if you've read the book Cruelty and Silence.
Which one?
Cruelty and Silence by
Makia? Yeah, I know the book.
Well, since you've read it, would you like to respond to some of the criticisms of yourself?
That's extremely easy. They're complete fabrications. And furthermore, they're conscious fabrications, and furthermore, they've been exposed. If you want, I don't even have to tell you, because it's in print. The book has been exposed as pure fraud. I know the guy. He's an old Trotskyite who sort of shifted sides at some stage and figuring out a new way of puffing up his reputation. He's actually a guy who is quite wealthy because he made a lot of money working for Saddam Hussein, as he concedes, incidentally. He was part of an architectural firm in London which was building monuments for Saddam Hussein and so on. Now he's trying to be the good Arab, the kind of Arab who will say everything's the fault of the Arabs. Every oppressed community offers such people. Like, you can find blacks who say, look, it's all the fault of the blacks. Okay, they're honored and they get professorships and this and that. And Makia, it's obvious why. And nobody cares whether they tell the truth or whether they're lying or whatever. They just have a useful social function. And we just need people now who says, look, the problem with the third world is their bad culture and, their bad genes and so on. And if you can get one of those guys to come up and do it, then, it's marvelous. Everybody loves him. Makia is not a fool, and he understands this, and he knows that he can write as many lies as he likes, and they'll be exposed in some scholarly journal or something, but it's not going to have any effect. And that's the book. So, for example, the worst lies are not about me. I play a marginal role. His worst lies are about Arab writers. The main thrust of the book, if you don't know the book, is that, the big problem in the Arab world is that all the Arab intellectuals love Saddam Hussein, and, they never criticize themselves, and they're always, and so on and so forth. It's their fault, not your fault. Like, you rich white guys, you didn't do anything, don't worry about it. And he goes after Arab writers. Well, who knows what some Egyptian writer has written, because it's in Arabic. All right. Turns out he's just flat out lying. There's a good review of this in the Professional Journal of the Middle Eastern Society, the Middle East Journal, in which the guy who knows Arabic just goes through the writings of the people he's referring to, and he is simply lying about them. And it's not just that he's lying. These people are not like him. They're courageous people. These are people who are fighting against oppression and tyranny in their own countries, where they can be sent off to jail or killed and so on. They're not sitting in Cambridge, They're not sitting in London making money by building monuments to Saddam Hussein. They're not sitting in Cambridge, having fun. These are people who are actually fighting oppression. And to lie about them, and claim that they're the guys who are responsible for it, that's a level of degradation that not many people reach. With regard to me, it's a marginal issue. He knows, look, he's a smart guy. He knows who the official targets are. There's a certain number of people you can tell any lie you like about because everybody hates them. You know, everybody rich hates them. Everybody powerful and privileged and rich hates them, so you can tell as many lies as you like. That's understood. And he understands it. He's not a fool. So he has alleged quotes from me. If you want to look at what actually happened, there's a review by, a couple of reviews I can tell you, which just went through it. They're perfectly obvious lies. I mean, just take a look at his footnotes. Is there anything footnoted? No, there isn't. There's a footnote to a talk, a transcript of to a talk that he claims he heard. There's nothing footnoted that you can look up. Well, all right, the transcript of that talk happens to have been published. Okay, so for example, I don't remember the whole story, but one of his big things is he says that I called on Kuwait to have democracy, but I didn't say it about Iraq. All right, you take a look at the talk, which is in print. It was published by Open Magazine because of these guys tape it and so on. It doesn't say that at all. What it says, it ran through the various proposals that had been made, that were on the table, that many people had made about a negotiated settlement. I just went through them all, you know. Well, one of them happened to be for a plebiscite in Kuwait. So I quoted.
What was your main proposal?
Pardon?
What was your main view?
Oh, he knows exactly what it was. My main proposal was that there were, in fact, significant options for a negotiated settlement. In fact, at the time, up until the bombing, starting in late August, Saddam Hussein had effectively offered to withdraw. And the United States didn't want him to, because they wanted to have a war. So, and in fact, this was mostly suppressed in the press. But the facts are there, and it's by now conceded. The withdrawal proposal that Saddam Hussein had made was in fact supported by about 60% of the American population, 2/3 of the American population, right up to the bombing. But they didn't know they were supporting it because it had been suppressed. I was not suppressing it, and my proposal at the time was we should explore it. We don't know if it's serious or not. The only way you can find out if it's serious is by exploring it. The U.S. is refusing to do that. It has flatly refused to follow the diplomatic track. In fact, back in late August, Thomas Friedman, the Times diplomatic correspondent, kind of let the cat out of the bag. What he said is that the U.S. wants to block the diplomatic track. He's quoting, somebody from the State Department, because if they pursue the diplomatic track, there might be a political settlement with basically back to the previous status quo, and the U.S. doesn't want that, because we want to show that we can win by force. Very important to show that you've got the guys with the guns are going to win by force. And my view was we should take that, we should pursue that option, and Kanan Makia knows it. Incidentally, you can find out easily what my view was, because it's in print all over the place. Here's something you can't find out, what his view is. See, his book is about silence. He claims the Arabs were silent about what you could do. Well, there was, in fact, one Arab who was totally silent, Kanan Makia. From the time of and you can find this out, from the time of the invasion of Kuwait up until March 6th, that is after it was over, there is not a public word on this topic from Kanan Makia. I mean, he has 2 or 3 articles, but they're mostly devoted to things like denouncing Edward Said. That was the big issue at that time. But there is nothing said about what we should do. All right? Now, it's not that he had any problem getting in the press. I mean, he would have been all over the place in the press. Everybody's dying for it. Like at MIT, where I was, we wanted Iraqi dissidents. There were Iraqi dissidents, good, courageous Iraqi dissidents, not frauds like him. And if we could ever find one, one of the main ones actually came through from London. I put him on, I got him on the radio. I put him right on teaching at MIT that day. We didn't get Kanan Makia on the teaching because he wouldn't open his mouth. He's too busy attacking other people for being silent. Now, why didn't he open his mouth? Good reason. Everybody knows it. The reason is because if he came out against the war, he would have lost his new friends, the rich guys who were paying for him. If he came out for the war, he would have lost the last shreds of credibility he has in the Iraqi dissident community. So what he did was shut up. In fact, the only place you can find out anything about what the Iraqi dissidents were saying is in stuff I wrote, not in stuff he wrote, because he didn't write anything, nor did he give any public talks. He was busy going around back corridors spreading gossip about people. And the book is just full of outrageous lies, which have been exposed in print if you want. But it makes no difference, you know. They're useful lies, so therefore they stand.
However, wasn't he an Iraqi citizen at the time?
At the time?
Yes. And
Well,
he was writing under a pseudonym also.
look, the pseudonym was a joke. First of all, then he lived in Cambridge. Everybody knew who he was. It was a joke. Actually, he wrote under several pseudonyms. Everyone knew who he was, you know. I mean, it would have taken Iraqi intelligence about 30 seconds to figure out who he was if they didn't know. The pseudonym is part of the game by which you pretend to be threatened, you know. Looks really exciting if you're writing under a pseudonym. Oh my God, these guys are trying to get me. Meanwhile, you know, he's head of an architectural firm which is working for Saddam Hussein, and everyone knew who he was, you know. It's like a comic strip. I mean, up until the early 80s, he was a kind of a militant Trotskyite, you know, and then he shifted. If you're interested, there is stuff in the professional literature which exposes all of this. But it's irrelevant, you know, it's kind of irrelevant. It's sort of like exposing the lies of some commissar in Stalinist Russia. What's the use? I mean, they're performing their function. It doesn't matter whether they're lies or not. And as I say, the stuff he said about me is so insignificant I wouldn't even bother responding. The bad stuff is what he said about people who are really, you know, courageously struggling against oppression in tough conditions. To lie about them and claim they're being silent and they're conforming, that is, you know, that's a lot worse than telling lies about me and Edward Said.
So Chomsky, one of the main features of the world economy today is that scarcity of capital is one of the driving global interest rates. How do you think this is after 1800?
Sorry, the last, I think it's less.
After 1800.
After 1800?
The capital is flowing into areas where the yields are higher. How do you think this is going to impact the top-down style of functioning of the multinational corporations? And the related question is that where do you view the concept of countervailing power in this new setup?
I didn't get the last part.
How do you view the concept of countervailing power?
Of countervailing power? Yeah. Well, first of all, about a shortage of capital, I don't really agree with that. There's a huge amount of capital floating around in international markets. It's just changed in character. In fact, there's the World Bank, their latest estimate is about $14 trillion of capital in international transactions. That's way beyond what it used to be. It's just shooting up. However, its character has changed. If you go back to 1970, about 90% of the capital used in international exchanges and stuff was for investment and trade, about 10% speculation. By 1990, those figures had reversed. It was 90% speculation and 10% trade. The last estimate I've seen, which is by a pretty good international economist, David Felix, is that today it's gotten to 5% investment and trade and 95% speculation. So what's happened is a huge growth in the amount of capital, but a complete shift in its, you know, a really radical shift in what it's used for. It's used for speculation for currencies, really. Well, you know, there's some reasons for that. The reason, I mean, there are a lot of reasons. One major reason is that in the early 1970s, the U.S. dismantled the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system, which was set up after the Second World War, was a system for regulation of international finance. So the basic idea is that the dollar, you know, the United States had all the money in the world at that time. So the dollar was fixed against gold and other currencies were fixed against the dollar. And there were various mechanisms to adjust here and there, you know, when you had problems. Well, that system made the U.S. basically the world's banker. And it was an enormous shot in the arm for U.S. corporations. In fact, that started off multinational corporations, which were mostly U.S. at the time. It enabled them to take over a large part of the world economy. However, by around 1970, the U.S. couldn't sustain that role anymore. And since we're the big guys and we do what we feel like, Nixon just dismantled it. You know, simply dismantled the system. Well, ever since then, it's been a system of, you know, of unregulated international exchanges, and of course, it's gone totally insane. You know, it's what one of the leading international economists, Susan Strange of the University of London, called, or London School of Economics, I guess, called casino capitalism. The way you make money now is by speculating against currencies. And the telecommunications revolution, which came along in between, makes it really easy to do this very fast. So last estimates I saw, there's more than $1 trillion a day moving from one financial market to another. Well, that just completely overwhelms the total resources of even rich countries, let alone minor ones. That's why you get the headlines you get in the newspapers these days. When the U.S. economy starts to grow a little bit, there's fear. You know, they're always worried about the fear of growth. You know, like there might be jobs and there might be production. And that's a problem. You got to stop that. So therefore the Fed raises interest rates. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. It's on the front page of the newspaper all the time. Well, yeah, that's because speculative capital wants stable currency. They don't want, they don't want inflation, because then they lose if you're in the bond market and stuff. So what you've got is this fantastic speculation against any currency that might, if some country, even a rich one like the United States, the top one, but certainly any smaller one, if they start to carry out national economic programs that would, say, stimulate the economy or redistribute or something like that, they're going to get an attack on their currency, which will destroy it, because governments can't withstand this anymore. There's too much capital around, and it's too free. And therefore, you're going to have to back off those policies. So there's basically no national economic planning. This is, Paul Volcker, who's the former head of the Federal Reserve Board, just chaired a study on this, where they attribute about 50%, there's been a very sharp decline in the growth rate worldwide since 1970, and they attribute about 50% of that decline just to the effect of speculative markets. James Tobin, who's another Nobel Prize-winning economist, came out a couple of years ago with a proposal for, I think it's a sensible proposal. Actually, the UN may take it up, so it may actually hit the papers, in which case Wall Street will go berserk. But he came out with a very sensible proposal for a tax on international financial transactions, meaning like if you shift your money, from francs to, marks or something, because you're speculating against maybe some change in the interest rate, there should be a tax on that. And that would have the effect of slowing down financial markets and tending to make it more attractive to use funds for investment and trade, things that do something. And maybe that would have it's going to be really hard to get that through, because you've got huge financial power now which is blocking it. But I think that's what's going on. I don't think it's a shortage of capital by any means. It's just a complete shift in the composition of it and what it's doing. Very radical shift. There's a lot of work on this, incidentally, and it's a big problem. I didn't mention it in my talk because there wasn't time, but that's one of the major factors that's changed the world economy radically. There was a last part which I forgot. Countervailing power? Well, that's what I ended up saying. Countervailing power has to be popular power. That's what unions were. That's what Chiapas, Mexico is. That's what popular organizations in Haiti are. That's countervailing power. If it reaches a sufficient scale, it'll make a difference. If it doesn't reach a sufficient scale, it won't make a difference. There isn't going to be any other countervailing power. Nor has there ever been in the past. It's the way history works.
I've heard actually that there were quite a few white faces at President in this field. I think yours was correct. One of the few that were not FBI and police.
At the what?
FBI or police.
Yeah, there were some FBI and police, right? I agree. I was putting that aside. I don't. Were you at the funeral? No, you're too young. Sorry.
In my former life.
Yeah. Actually, there were very few. It was pretty dramatic. I think there were maybe a dozen, and probably 1,000 people.
In the tradition of dissident ambition, I'd like to ask you about the effectiveness of financial discretion. And before I go on, I'd like to say that it is my generation's responsibility in terms of how much we choose to participate in shaping our own future and the future of newer generations.
Yeah. Well, your second comment answers your first question. Yeah, that's it. I spend.
We have to learn in some way, therefore.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I spend an enormous amount of time doing things like giving talks all over the place.
But this is what I like to learn about.
Pardon?
I would like to learn about this talk. So
what's the effect? Well, the effect.
Let me just ask the question first.
Yeah, oh, sorry, I thought you'd asked her.
I'm not laying responsibility on you per se, but
Yeah.
I'd like to comment about just the culture of American universities these days.
Well-
I found it disturbing that at some of the most deadly points that you made people laugh. And perhaps you find your style of dry away more effective. However, I can tell you from the other end, no one was laughed. My family members, and along with the rest of my country, died under American bombs. So I cannot find it in any humor in me to laugh at the correlation between Western aid and torture.
Yeah, I don't think it's funny either. Yeah,
So, again, I'm not laying responsibility on you, but
Yeah.
I have a three-point critique. And the first one is, obviously this is academic, so at the academic level, the kind of information that you provide tonight is extremely crucial. But there seems to be no, and people perhaps are grasping a theoretical understanding of it, but there's no, I don't sense a connection between mind and soul. Second point is, you seem to be placing all the responsibility on the American government and American corporations. And that, to me, tends to absolve especially middle-class Americans of any responsibility for exercising democracy to change their country's foreign policy. And the third point, which kind of brings it all together, which is these kinds of discussions, I feel, tend to sanitize a lot of very deadly issues going on around the world. And especially for those of us coming from the third world, there's nothing sanitized about it. So in that sense, it all seems to me to lead to a form of complacent inaction, because by providing people with a theoretical understanding, they feel like they understand it, but there's no inertia for going out and making changes.
yeah. I mean, I can't comment on style and technique. That's for you to decide. You're the judge, not me. But the last point is basically accurate. I mean, if you just have information and you don't do anything about it, you might as well read comic books. So the only point of all of this activity, which a lot of people, I'm one of them, have been involved in for years and years, is to try to be part of active, ongoing popular movements. Actually, to tell you the truth, I don't talk any differently when I talk to poor people in Nicaragua or the West Bank and Palestine or anywhere else. And you can discover that, if you like, by reading what I write, because some of what I've written comes straight from there. For example, the book that somebody mentioned a book that I'm coming out with that happened to be based on lectures delivered in Cairo. I had a book 10 years ago, which is based on lectures that were delivered in Managua, mostly to non-academic audiences, just people who could somehow figure out a way to get there while the electricity was off. And I don't talk any differently. Maybe it's the right way, maybe it's the wrong way, I don't know. It's the only way I know how to do it. And the only, so if there's a better way to do it, I think people ought to do it in a better way. But the main point is, if it's just something you store away in the back of your head and you say, oh, isn't that interesting, and then you go on with the rest of your life, it was a waste of time. In fact, I was going to say, before I realized that your question hadn't been ended, that, for which I apologize, that I spend a lot of time giving talks. Often, it'll be some state university with 2,500 people there and stuff. And one thing that has struck me over and over again over the years is that very few people, or sometimes no one, is set up for a follow-up. Like, there are plenty of people who, when they hear something about the world they don't like, want to do something about it, but they do not know what to do. And the only people who can tell them what to do are the people who are doing it in that place. The people who are sitting outside and manning whatever the right word is, the desks, and giving out the literature and telling them, why don't you come to my meeting next week, and here's where we're working on. Those people can tell you what to do, and if they're not there, it's just like you say. It's, maybe changes the way you look at things, but it's not useful. So, for example, I gave a talk not unlike this in Geneva a couple of weeks ago, organized by the Women's International League, incidentally. And it was all third world people. It's third world people involved, mostly exiles and so on. Same kind of talk, and it's basic. And they were asking the same kind of questions. What do we do about it? And there's always the same answer. You have to decide what to do about it. And if there aren't efforts to really follow it up, and they always have to be local because there's no other way to do it, then yes, you're exactly right. It's mostly a waste of all of our time.
I've been impressed that around about 2.5 hours we've been discussing capitalism, that you mentioned the word socialism and communism. And I'm sure that you're aware of the magazine The Senate and the Jane Geneviese's article about the crimes of communism. Could you make some comments as to where he fits in these days?
Genovese?
Yes, and the left, and how...
Well, I thought that...
I want to ask you directly the question which he asked himself and answered, but could you comment on what you knew and...
Oh, I knew. I know now what I knew when I was 10 years old. I mean, I know it in more detail now. But when I was 10 years old, I already knew well enough that Lenin and Trotsky had destroyed quickly, within months, every socialist element in the pre-Bolshevik period, and that they had done it for quite principled reasons. They were the two kinds of reasons. Partly they were orthodox Marxists, and it was against the iron laws of history and all that kind of stuff, which if you know the Marxist canon, for a revolution to take place in Russia. So they were running kind of holding action until it took place in Germany, at which point they'd be a backwater. And part of the reason was because they were just brutal authoritarians of a kind who Bakunin had talked about 50 years before, when he said that, the segment of the intellectual class is going to use the popular movements as a technique for gaining power, gaining state power, and then they'll create the most brutal autocracy in human history while destroying every socialist tendency, and they were part of that. And if this wasn't obvious to you, it was obvious to me when I was 10 years old, without knowing a lot of facts, back around 1940, 12 years old, I don't want to exaggerate. At that point, I certainly understood it pretty well. And now I know more facts. I don't know any more about the Gulag because I already read George Maximoff and plenty of stuff that was around at that time, which is probably more accurate than what's around today. And I know the same thing now. So, it's as far as the end of the Soviet tyranny is concerned, that's a gain for socialism. And it's just like the fall of Hitler was a gain for socialism. It eliminates a barrier to it. Now, Gene Genovese has a different history. He was a Stalinist all his life. So, until a couple of years ago, he was a very, as he says, it's correct, he was a deeply committed Stalinist. As for the editors of Dissent, they were a little different. They were committed Leninists, including Irving Howe, until around 1950. So like about when they were grown up already. They were considerably older than I was, but they were certainly old enough then to have understood what should have been obvious to anyone. Actually, it should have been obvious in 1920, but I wasn't around then. And it was obvious to people in 1920. It was obvious to Bertrand Russell. It was obvious to Rosa Luxemburg. It was obvious to the major intellectuals of the socialist movement, like Anton Pannekoek and others, the leading intellectual of the Second International, way on the left of Lenin, incidentally. It was certainly obvious to the libertarian socialists, the whole anarchist movement, and independent socialists like Russell. All that was obvious by, certainly 1920, no later. If people insisted on hanging on as Trotskyists or Stalinists, means they just were anti-socialists. Well, okay. For those guys to come along now and tell people who always were opposed to this stuff that they've discovered something, that's nice, but I'm not interested because I knew it when I was 10 years old. What more is there to say? They want to play their game for obvious reasons, but it's not any game that we should be involved in my opinion. We should recognize what I think is true. I've written about it plenty myself, that the Bolshevik Revolution, so-called revolution, it was really a coup, was really a counter-revolution, which placed state power in the hands of a highly authoritarian, anti-socialist group, which within a couple of months had destroyed the factory councils, had destroyed the Soviets, had dismissed the Constituent Assembly because they knew they were going to lose, and had eliminated every popular movement, and had done exactly what Trotsky said, turn the country into a labor army under the control of the maximal leader. That was mid-1918. Since then, there hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, they called it socialism, but they also called it democracy. They were people's democracies, the purest form of democracy. They were socialism. The left, the West, the big propaganda system in the world, of course, just laughed at the democracy part, but it loved the socialism part, because that's a way to defame socialism. So if you think that the fall of the Soviet Union is a blow to socialism, you ought to also think on the same grounds that it's a blow to democracy. After all, they call themselves democracies too, so why isn't it a blow to democracy? It makes as much sense. It's only when it gets filtered through the Western propaganda system that it's not a blow to democracy, but it is a blow to socialism. But, you know, there's absolutely no reason to play that game, whether you play it in dissent or in the nation or on the right or anywhere else. Expose it for the fraud that it is.
This comment that the ideology is flawed.
What ideology? The ideology of totalitarianism? Yeah, it's deeply flawed. I mean, they were the initial modern totalitarians. It's not, it has nothing to do with socialism. They destroyed socialism within weeks. You know, they didn't wait. By 1918, it was finished. And they knew it, you know, like it's not a secret. They knew it. I mean, in fact, Lenin, as soon as he sort of got grips of things after, he said, he moved to what he called state capitalism, which is what it was. It had nothing to do with socialism. Socialism, I mean, you can argue about what, there's no point arguing what the word means, but what it always meant at the core was that producers take control of production, you know, working people take control of production, what's sometimes called industrial democracy. That was the absolute core of it. Well, you know, there was more socialism in Germany, in Western Europe, than there was in Russia. You know, Russia's about the most anti-socialist place you can imagine since 1918. Had wage labor, had super exploitation, had no element of workers' control or involvement or participation. And it's pure, you know, what's it got to do with socialism? It's the exact opposite on every point. As I say, the West liked to call that socialism while laughing at the fact that they called themselves Democrats. But that's for purely propaganda reasons. I mean, unless you're committed to being part of the Western propaganda system, there's nothing to say about that issue of dissent except to laugh. And let me stress again that these guys who are now praising, half of the articles in there praise themselves, and the people who are praising themselves were Leninists up until 1950. They had nothing to praise themselves about.
Before he was brought into the government, Reich was writing articles of deploring the two-tier society that we're developing, and Bruce Babbitt was talking from environmental protection business. It seems the way to silence the widest critics is to bring them into the family. I was wondering if you ever had any feelers from the political...
If I ever had any what?
Any feelers?
Feelers?
To join the establishment, shall we say.
There have been a couple of really freaky, far-out parties that have occasionally asked me to run for vice president or something, but no, I don't.
But didn't Jerry Brown recruit your advice when he ran?
Well, you know, we spoke on the telephone, yeah.
But he was one of the few candidates.
Yeah, I mean, we had long talks about lots of things, sure. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to say what I think to anyone. I say exactly the same. I mean, what I say here is exactly what I say to everybody. You know, I mean, it doesn't really change much. So if somebody wants to ask, I mean, I've given talks at the State Department. You know, I was invited about 7 or 8 years ago, I guess. There's a thing at the State Department called the Open Forum, which, as you can guess, means the closed forum. You know? But it's open in the sense that outside speakers are allowed in, you know, to talk to the inside people. And there was a guy, actually happened to be black, and he also happened to get fired soon after. I don't know if this is correlated. But he was running the Open Forum for a while. And he invited me down to give a talk about U.S. policy in Central America. Well, I couldn't turn that one down. This was right at the peak of the worst atrocities and everything else. So I went, naturally, and I gave a talk which is virtually the same as the kind that a bunch of you have, you know, that you've taped and that other people have heard and so on. I mean, it was a little different because in order to avoid irrelevant discussion, I kept strictly to U.S. government documents. So I didn't make any factual claim unless it came out of an internal document, and they're damning enough, you know. So I spoke only from the point of view of the internal records, so there would be no discussion about authenticity. And other than that, and the conclusions come out exactly the same. You know, it was a very strong talk. It had a huge number of people. They were very enthusiastic. They all came up afterwards, asked me to sign their books and that kind of, like any talk at any, popular group. The only thing is they were all secretaries and, like junior aid officials and people like that. I mean, there were a couple of ambassadors around the edge. They didn't know what I was talking about. I had lunch with the policy planning staff afterwards. It was like lunch with any faculty group. I mean, they're off. They don't even know what's happening in the world. But sure, I'm happy to talk to them. But that's the limit. It's never going to get beyond that. I mean, unless they decide to commit suicide, which I don't see any reason why they should do. Last, two more.
I've done some research on the United States involved in Somalia and oil in Somalia. And I've also done a little bit of research on the United States corporate involvement in Sudan and Kenya and throughout the Sahara region of Africa. And the correlation between that and the draining of oil resources in the Middle East. And I'm wondering whether or not you've done any research on that, on the United States involved in Saharan Africa, oil, because places like Bahrain and Oman, they're tapping the oil resources. So
They're what?
They're running out of their oil.
Oh, they're not running out.
They're not.
No. I mean, maybe Bahrain, maybe, but not Saudi Arabia. Yeah. I mean, Saudi Arabia's got.
Yeah, but still oil.
Yeah, there'll be a limit. Yeah.
As much as they were, after the oil shock in 1970, either time. And I was wondering if you can comment on that.
I mean, look, the oil corporations are always looking for oil, and there haven't been a lot of surprises about this. I mean, if you go back to their records in the late 40s, they didn't have everything straight, but they pretty much knew, and now they know more. The reason why there's more diversification after 1973, when the oil price went up, doesn't have anything to do with discovering new oil. It has to do with the fact that the oil companies and indeed the U.S. government were not very much. In fact, the oil companies were very favorable about that was when the oil price quadrupled. Remember, in 1973, the oil companies were all for it, and the U.S. government was kind of ambivalent. The reason why the oil companies were for it was because as the oil price goes up, their profits go up even faster. And furthermore, when the oil prices got up high enough, as they finally did in 1973, they were able to bring online much more expensive oil that they'd already had, like Alaska and North Sea. But it was just they couldn't make enough profit by selling it, but now they were able to sell it. And that effect gives you the illusion of diversification, but it's mostly illusion. Though there's some. As far as Africa is concerned, yeah, sure, they're looking all over the place, but they haven't found a lot. And the business about Somalia, I think, was a misleading thing. I mean, what was pointed out at the time, and a lot of people thought was important at the time of the U.S. Intervention. Somebody wrote an article, a guy in the Los Angeles Times, pointing out something that was true, and a lot of people on the left picked it up, but I thought it was totally irrelevant. He pointed out that all the American oil companies are there. Well, that's true. And they were probably the ones who were most opposed to the intervention, because the only effect of the intervention is to make their operations harder. I mean, their intervention, it was obvious in advance, was going to end up being a catastrophe, and it was going to end up leading to a lot of anti-Americanism for good reasons. You murder a lot of people, they don't like you, and it was just going to make it harder for these guys to work. There was no way the U.S. intervention was going to improve their possibilities of getting oil out of Somalia, and it didn't. So I just don't think that was even a minor factor. In fact, if anything, it was probably a negative factor in the intervention.
There was an article in the magazine about Somalia where they talked about how the United States merged between using the oil corporation plants as central points for their operation.
Oh, sure. Look, I'm sure they would, but I mean, when the Marines go in, they're going to see if there's a white face around, and some guy, and they'll say, "Yeah, I'll stick my office in your place." I mean, yeah, wouldn't you do it? I mean, you would do it too, so would I, if we were playing that game. But I just don't think that means anything. I mean, the net effect of this stuff was probably to harm the operations of the oil companies. I mean, we'll know better 30 years from now when there's documents around, but it just doesn't look plausible. I mean, yes, but the first thing he said is true. Sure, they're looking for oil all over the world. I mean, actually, there are big sources available now. For one thing, the biggest resource still is essentially the Arabian Peninsula, but there's a huge amount of oil in the former Soviet Union. which nobody's tried to get much yet, mainly because it's too expensive. So, you know, there's apparently real technical problems in getting oil from, say, Siberia. You got to worry about permafrost, and it's expensive, you know. So they'll only go for those sources of oil when the cheap ones are running out. They are getting oil now from Central Asia, you know, which was part of the reason the oil prices are going down is because a lot of oil from the Russian Empire is entering world markets through Western corporations. But I think that dwarfs anything that's known from Africa, as far as I'm aware.
Professor Chomsky, I'd like to ask you a question about the recent coverage of the situation in Somalia. For the last 2 weeks, there have been much made of the fact that 18 United States soldiers were killed in that area of the world. At the same time, I didn't see very much coverage about the 300 that were killed at that same incident. Plus, before that, there were several other hundreds of women and children killed during this so-called humanitarian mission. Why is it that a lot of coverage is given to American casualties and almost none given to the indigenous people that die in these types of situations?
Yeah, what's more, there have been, the Belgian troops have been rampaging in Kismayu. There have been atrocities all over the place. A good study of them by African Rights, a group in London. Well, unfortunately, we know the answer. You know, that's one white face matters, one rich white face matters. A lot of poor black faces don't matter. Ultimately, as simple as that. Why is let's compare some of the real atrocity stories going on in the world. The Balkans, Bosnia, big atrocity story. Angola, big atrocity story. Everybody knows about Sarajevo. We're all Bosnians, you know. How many people know about Quito, where probably 3 times as many people were killed and are still being killed? And Angola, the number of atrocities, the death toll during the same period has probably been heavier. You can't say for sure because nobody covers it, but it looks heavier than it's been in the Balkans. Yet everyone is, you know, passionate about the Balkans, and Angola, you could maybe find an article once in 3 years. The answer is pretty simple. What's happening in the Balkans could harm rich white people who live pretty nearby. And what's happening in Angola, well, is more Africans killing each other. Who cares? Furthermore, in the Balkans, you can blame bad guys. In Angola, it's pretty hard to do that because you're blaming the American freedom fighter who was hailed as the greatest man since George Washington, and he's the one who's slaughtering people, so it's not a good story. So therefore, everyone is, you know, passionate about Bosnia, where doubtless horrifying atrocities are going on, but Angola doesn't matter. Or let's take Afghanistan. In the city of Kabul, capital city, current estimates are about 30,000 people have been killed since it was liberated, since the Russians were kicked out. Who killed them? Our man, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the most extreme Islamic fundamentalist maniac in the world, who happens to have been on the CIA payroll for the last 10 years. How much do you see about the Kabulis? You know, what's happening to them is like what Pol Pot did in Phnom Penh. In fact, worse. They killed more people in Afghanistan. It's worse than Sarajevo from what we know of it, which again is very little because nobody looks. Same answers. Wrong color, you know, wrong people carrying out the massacre. Far from Europe or the United States, doesn't hurt our interests much. All of it shows the same thing. The only value is, in the official culture at least, is self-interest. Everything else is a fake. Much else shows you the same thing. I just came back from Nicaragua a couple of weeks ago, for example. Well, in Nicaragua, in the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, there's 100,000 people starving to death. Most of them are Mestizo Indians. A few years ago, a couple of dozen Mestizo Indians were killed by the Sandinistas in the course of the Contra War. Well, you know, the outrage here, it was just, the skies were falling in. It was described as the worst terrorist act in the modern period, the worst genocide since Hitler, great laments about the mosquitoes. Okay, now 100,000 are dying, starving to death. You hear anything about it? No. I mean, they shifted categories. Then they were what my friend Edward Herman calls worthy victims. I mean, you could blame their fate on somebody we didn't like. Now they're unworthy victims. We're responsible for their vastly more harsh suffering. When you shift from worthy victim to unworthy victim, you don't get talked about anymore. All comes down to the same thing. Human rights are of purely instrumental value in the official culture. If you can use human rights for propaganda purposes or for career or power interests, very important. If they don't have that interest, of zero or negative importance. And that's Somalis. Somalis were, the whole Somalia operation was pure cynicism from the beginning. Pure cynicism. It was mainly, in my view, PR for the Pentagon. I mean, they figured they could send a couple of, 30,000 Marines in, get some nice shots of people giving out jelly beans to starving children, it would look good. People say we need an intervention force, then they'd pull them out or something would happen. The Somalis were just props. I mean, they were props for photo opportunities. If 300 of them got killed, and 700 wounded, mostly women and children, okay, that's sometimes the props get in the way. That's the way they looked at it.
In today's New York Times, Anthony Lewis writes that the message to the military rulers in Haiti was unmistakable. You can push us around easily. The United States government is so afraid of its public opinion after Somalia that even you can intimidate it. That's the message to Haiti. He mentions something called credibility, as does A.M. Rosenthal in today's Times, and that's a term that's been kicked around a lot. What exactly do they mean by U.S. credibility?
It means everybody in the world has to quake in their boots at the fear that the United States might do to them what it feels like doing. Henry Kissinger, for example, was very concerned about our credibility. We had to show that nobody's going to push us around because people have to be intimidated. As far as the message to the military in Haiti, the message that they're getting from the United States is, we don't want you to kill rich people. You go destroying the popular movements and slaughtering the peasant movement and so on. We're not going to make much of a fuss about that. But when you start assassinating rich people on the streets and you start pushing out the rich families from the monopolies and taking them over, and if you interfere with our effort to restore the traditional conservative rulers in power, and the military are interfering that, then we don't like you and we're going to stop you. But we're not going to really stop you, because there are lots of things they could be doing that they're not doing. Some of them have been pointed out even in Congress, like Congressman John Conyers has made some very obvious comments, which I haven't seen in the New York Times. He said, look, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, estimates that maybe up to $500 million a year of cocaine is flowing through Haiti, and that's what's keeping the military leaders rich. $500 million or a third of $1 billion, a lot of money for these guys. Well, Conyers points out, he says, look, the U.S. Navy is capable of picking up every skiff that has 5 guys trying to flee from these torturers and sending them back. We have that capability. How come we don't have the capability of finding one boat bringing narcotics in and out of Haiti? Or how come we're not, the U.S. Air Force is incapable of interdicting plane flights that are using Haiti as transshipment points? How come we're not capable of telling our stooges in the Dominican Republic, which is what they are, we don't want you to continue to supporting the narco-traffic racket that's keeping these guys alive? Well, there's no answers to that question and no reports of it, but I think we know the answers. During the period when Aristide was in power, that 7 months, that was the one period when there was real cooperation between the DEA and the Haitian authorities, and they were really working on narco-trafficking. When he got kicked out, that was the end of it. In fact, a couple of months later, the DEA office in Haiti was shut down because of death threats. Now, the U.S. usually doesn't stop drug enforcement if somebody said, I'm going to kill you. But they just pulled the office out. Well, you know, here's a whole area of things that are not being done, which they're not telling the military, we want you out. And in fact, according to sources, church sources, close to President Aristide, Father Adrian, in fact, is one of the main church officials who's close to him. Haitian officers, high-level Haitian officers, have been in training in the United States in Fort Benning, Georgia, as recently as early October of this year. They're still getting trained here. Furthermore, General Cedras, the head of the Army, and Michel Francois, who's the head of the police chief, you know, the guy who's really running all this killers, well, they come straight from U.S. training. They've been trained in Fort Benning, Georgia. The talk about the that means several things. For one thing, it means, what we know anyway, that the contacts between top-level U.S. government and these thugs are very close. And if they're told, they'll follow orders. The other thing we know is that for U.S. trainers to be sent in to professionalize the security forces, I mean, it's not even a joke. Where did these guys get the training? All of them. Yeah, right here. We're going to send in the same guys that taught them what to do and teach them how to do it better. I mean, you start asking these questions, you get to the real issue. I mean, it's perfectly true that the United States does not want attachés running around the street killing rich guys and generals taking over the monopolies. They don't want that. That's not what we want. What the U.S. wants, is to restore President Aristide as a figurehead in some cubicle somewhere, so Washington can say, look what great Democrats we are, and restore to power people of what they call the moderate sector of the business community, meaning they don't want to just go around murdering everyone in the streets. They want to have assembly plants for U.S. manufacturers where you can get people to work for 14 cents an hour and kick them out when they're done, so you get a lot of profits. That's the progressive sector of the business community, and they want them in power. And if you look at the planning, it's all been geared to that. It's all been geared to trying to force, to first of all have the military spend a couple of years destroying the popular movement, so they're just devastated and terrorized. And that means that even if Aristide did come back, he maybe couldn't even organize the political support to let him do anything anymore. Furthermore, they want Aristide to be an absolute figurehead. He was forced to pick a prime minister who is apparently a decent and surely very courageous man, Robert Malval, but who is opposed to Aristide's populist reforms. The press is quick to tell you that, and is acceptable to the business community and even the coup leaders. That was the man he picks as prime minister. Now he's being pressed to what they call democratize further. Democratize further means extend the cabinet to include, if not the actual police chief, then his brother-in-law. In other words, people close to the military sector. That's called democratization. Democratization is when you cut out entirely, 100%, the popular movements that brought him to power. So you cut out the people who gave him an overwhelming landslide victory. They have to be out in a democracy. And then we democratize by taking a sector that goes from the less bloody part of the business community over to the more bloody part of the army, and we make sure they're satisfied, and that's democracy. And then you have President Aristide sitting in a cubicle until it's time to get rid of him, and people are forgotten, because that proves that we're Democrats. Now, the military got in the way of that plan. They got out of hand. They interfered with the plan, and therefore they're going to have to pay for it one way or another, maybe a Marine invasion or something, but then we'll go back on track.
You've written extensively about the link between U.S. foreign policy and terrorism, and the death squads and torture in third world nations. A good example of this is Dan Mitrione, was a police advisor in Uruguay and Brazil. Can you tell us if there are continuing programs like this still working?
Yeah.
You've written extensively about the link between U.S. foreign policy and death squads and torture in third world countries. A good example of this is the Dan Mitrione case, a police advisor in Brazil and Uruguay. A common belief is that with a change in administrations, there's a change in policy. Are these programs still in existence, considering the fact that we had a change just recently in 1992?
There's no evidence for any change. I mean, of course, to find examples like Dan Mitrione is hard. Jack Langus, who wrote that book, did a lot of work, and they dug up actual examples of U.S. advisors involved in torture. There are other examples. Alan Nairn, who exposed the origins of the death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador, starting in the Kennedy administration and then being picked up afterwards, he was able to find direct evidence of U.S. trainers involved. And there's further evidence. Now, let me give you one example which was totally suppressed in the United States in a most amazing way. There was, several years ago, there was a civil and human rights group, non-governmental human rights group in El Salvador, which continued to function under the most horrendous conditions. I mean, this was a real, this place was being run by mass murderers, by Nazis, who we were training. Incidentally, we were training and aiding and supporting. And their first, most of their leaders, the leaders of the civil rights group, were murdered. But they continued to function. And a couple of years ago, they were all arrested, all of them, and sent to the prison, for Mariana Prison, where the political prisoners are. But these are tough characters. I mean, they kept doing their work in prison. And they succeeded in, there were, I think, 432 political prisoners in the unit that they were in. And they managed to interview 430 of them, a lot of them on videotape. They sneaked cameras in and tapes and so on. They had them sign affidavits describing individually what had been done to them. Of course, they'd all been tortured. And the independent, these are lawyers, and they were careful, and it was, they compiled a 160-page document, including with some videotapes added, of the individual tortures that these people underwent. And some of them mentioned that there were North American, meaning U.S., a major in uniform who was present at the torture sessions. Well, it's a very corrupt society, and they were able to sneak this stuff out. Came out. It went to a church group that works with humanitarian groups in El Salvador and California church group, interfaith church group. They gave it to the press, and they circulated around the country to the press. One newspaper covered it, the San Francisco Herald-Examiner, period. Boston, not the Boston Globe, not the New York Times, not the Washington Post. Nobody would cover it. I mean, there's direct evidence. I mean, not only of horrifying torture going on and terror going on in our dependency, but even of direct U.S. involvement. Nobody would touch it. Well, that's, it's hard to get evidence when the information system works like this. As far as what's going on now, well, take, say, Fort Benning, Georgia, where the top Haitian military is being trained. They're functioning. Nobody stopped them. You look at their record. I mean, every major killer in Latin America has gotten his training there. If take, say, again, El Salvador, the Roberto Dobison, who was the head of, the god of the death squad killers, he came from there. The worst murderers, the Atlacatl Brigade, it's one of these rapid action teams. You take a look at the UN report on atrocities in El Salvador. A lot of them were conducted by the Atlacatl and other fast action brigades, many of them fresh from their U.S. training. Some of the worst atrocities were carried out just after they had come back from U.S. training, including the assassination of the Jesuits, which was carried out by this U.S. trained group. Which did finally spark some interest and concern here. If there's been any change, there's been no notification of it or no indication of it. I mean, these are policies that go way back, that go across administrations. A lot of the worst policies were set in motion during the Kennedy administration, the one that Clinton models himself on. They were the most deeply committed to organization of tough, brutal security forces. In fact, the Kennedy administration made a historic change in Latin America. In 1962, the Kennedy administration shifted the mission of the Latin American military. We're powerful enough to do that. We run them because they're all trained here and armed here and so on. We tell them what to do. They changed the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense to internal security. Hemispheric defense was a leftover from the Second World War. Sort of Nazis are coming. So they dropped that, and they changed it to internal security, and internal security is just a euphemism. Internal security means war against your own population. Kennedy's own main specialist in counterinsurgency, the guy who was in charge of counterinsurgency planning from 1961 through 1966, Charles Machling, later wrote about this. And he said that the effect of this decision was to change the Latin American military from just ordinary killers and robbers to neo-Nazi gangsters who set in motion a reign of terror and slaughter over the continent that's without parallel in the history of the continent. And that's his evaluation. He was right in the center of it. Is exactly correct. Well, they're Clinton's heroes. I mean, that's where his whole administration is trying to duplicate. There's no change between Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives as far as the record shows on issues of this kind.
Two quick opinions, and then two quick statements and your opinions on them. I read the reviews for Langut's book about the Mitrione case, plus on the execution of Charles Hormer by Thomas Hauser. And they were both panned by the New York Times and all the major papers. They said it suggests conspiracies, and the litany of things about that. The other thing is, in the papers they're mentioning now something about the fact that the Haitians are going to be trained in police techniques. Doesn't that sound familiar?
Oh, yeah. I mean, of course, these things will be panned. Of course, you're not allowed to say anything bad about the United States. Incidentally, Languth was a New York Times reporter, one of their best reporters, so I didn't remember what you said, but the fact that they panned his book is kind of interesting. As far as the military in Haiti is concerned, being trained by U.S. trainers, it's not even a joke. They all have been trained by U.S. trainers. That's where they learned their craft, from the top down. Cedras and Francois, the two top guys, military and police, both come straight from U.S. training. And very recently, apparently, they've been trained. It's hard to get exact details on this, but as I mentioned, according to very reliable Haitian sources, they've been trained as recently as this month, October 1993. To say that they're going to be trained by U.S. trainers is ridiculous. I was in Haiti not very long ago, a few weeks ago, and it was interesting. I mean, before the worst terror picked up, it was bad, but not like this. It was interesting. I talked to a lot of people. I mean, priests, underground, labor leaders who've been practically beaten to death in police custody, organizers, people in the marketplace, and so on. And when constant question I was asking all the time is, well, do you want a U.S. Would you like nobody talks about UN. Everyone knows that means U.S. intervention. Do you want a U.S. intervention force to get these guys off your back? And people are really suffering and terrified. Like in the marketplace, people are afraid to talk to you. They look around and say oblique things like, well, there are eyes everywhere, meaning the spy right behind you. And they'll say indirect things, but they won't talk. They're obviously terrified. But when you talk to people about what about intervention, they're very ambivalent. I mean, of course, they want the terror to stop. On the other hand, the idea that, forget intervention, just training, most of them didn't want intervention. But when you talk about training, they were ambivalent about that. They don't want the Haitian security forces professionalized. I mean, in a way, it's better for them to have thugs and killers who go around shooting randomly than to have something like the Guatemalan army. I mean, that's professional. That's like straight out of Nazi Germany. We really professionalize them properly. So when they go out killing people, it's like 100,000 people, and systematic and careful and organized and so on. Or it's like the Atlacado Brigade, they're very professional. They're professional killers. That's in a way a lot worse than narco traffickers and thugs and gangsters who may be brutal, but sort of random brutality. So professionalizing the armed services and the police, especially when it's being done by the guys who trained them in the first place, is not a very appealing prospect. Now, I wouldn't say that they opposed it. I would say there's a lot of ambivalence. These are people who are really suffering, and if something could offer some hope of stopping their suffering, they may welcome it even if they don't like it. Like, for example, if there were a Marine intervention at this point, I suspect the reactions would be ambivalent. You'd have people welcoming it, because maybe they'll get these killers off their backs. On the other hand, plenty of people will not welcome it, because although we don't know the history, they do know the history. Everyone talks about the Marines, the Marine occupation. And here it's described as benevolent, and we built roads and so on, but there it's described as what it was. The Marines were vicious racists, as was the Wilson administration, which sent them in. They were, and the Marine, they murdered thousands of people. They totally demolished the constitutional system because the Haitians didn't understand the merits of turning Haiti into a U.S. plantation. They reinstituted slavery. They established these military forces, which are now terrorizing them. They vastly increased the racism. Haiti's very racist. It's the light mulatto elite for 180 years been kind of running the place, and the differences in color, shape, from the point of view of American racists, they're all black, but from their point of view, there are differences, and that's intensified by the extreme racism of the Marines and the Americans, which is way beyond anything even in their society, so that sharpened the racist divisions. Well, this is the legacy of the Marines. They know that. It left their country as a disaster area. So even if maybe the Marines might get these current killers off their back, they don't like what's coming.
Normally, when you're giving political lectures, you keep your emotions very much under control. Last week, you came back from Nicaragua, and I thought that your talk that night was much more impassioned than normal, and even last evening, too. I was wondering if some things you saw in Nicaragua led to this, what I thought was an increased level of impassionment.
Well, whenever I come back from someplace in the third world, and Nicaragua's a particularly bad case, it's very hard to keep your rage under control. I mean, what's going on in Nicaragua at the moment is just a major atrocity. First of all, we destroyed the country. I mean, the country's been driven back to probably 50 years. It's now the poorest country in the hemisphere except Haiti. It's right above Haiti. The only reason it's different from Haiti is the U.S. hasn't yet taken over the security forces. So there isn't the terror from the security forces that you get in most places. So you don't have to be terrified if you see a soldier or a policeman. But the society is absolutely coming apart at the seams. There's mass starvation. There's no work. There's no investment. The social fabric is falling apart. So that there's a lot of crimes of violence, for example, just out of desperation. It's like the slums here. You tear apart the social fabric, and people are just desperate. They take out they go after each other. Mostly they go after the most vulnerable people, like women and children. There's a lot of rape and that sort of thing. A lot of robbery because people can't live. They're starving. But that's not enough for us. We've got to torture them more. So now I mentioned the Atlantic coast. They're getting aid from Canada and Europe, not from here. In fact, here nobody cares anymore. They want to die. That's great, because we're killing them. In the streets of Managua, there are thousands of children starving. I mean, you drive down the street, and the kids swarm over your car and try to get a few pennies. You go down the street at night, and some miserable little waif will stick his face against the window and plead for 10 cents, so maybe he can survive the night. The worst part of it is if you're driving. It happened we were driving with a friend, a Nicaraguan woman, and she pleaded with us not to let the windows down because she's so terrified of the social breakdown that she's afraid that if you open the window, there'll be some guy right behind the kid who'll come and rob you or do something. So here you are watching these kids obviously starving. You could have seen them during the day trying to beg all day, and you can't give them a Cordova, 2 cents. You live through this for a while, and then you read the IMF reports published there, not here. The IMF reports, which means U.S. orders, say we're going to strangle you. I mean, while I was there, in fact, the IMF report was leaked by the government and published there. They're calling for it's the harshest demand that any country has ever faced. I think the United States would go under if we were given demands like that. And some of them are just pure sadism. So like privatize water. They got to privatize. What does it mean to privatize water? It means that a private company will run the water supply, and that means if you don't have money to pay that month's bill, which like 70% of the population isn't going to have, it means your children die. That's why we have to privatize water, to make sure that the children die. Cut back $60 million from social services. Well, social services have practically been destroyed. There's the health service, the infant mortality rate is going up, malnutrition is going up, it's all, because there's no health services. But they got to cut back 60 million from what's left. Why 60 million? Well, I have my suspicions about that. Some of the banks were already privatized, and those privatized banks last year sent out $60 million. Instead of using that $60 million in Nicaragua, they sent it to New York for the stock exchange, because you make more money there than giving credits to bean farmers. I wouldn't be surprised if that 60 million was picked for its symbolic value. In other words, we know what we're doing to you, and we're going to do it worse. They got to privatize all the banks now. Terminate credit, meaning no credit for poor bean farmers. In fact, Nicaragua just lost its bean harvest. This is a poor country, a country of poor, starving people. You take away the bean harvest, and they're really going to starve. Why'd they lose it? Because there was no credit for bean farmers to plant their crops. They need credit. They don't have private wealth. And instead, the money was going to New York banks. That's what's called the free market. You use the most productive use of resources. On top of all of this, while I was there, Senator Dodd of Connecticut, great liberal, was coming down, and he's now been there and back. His mission was to ensure that Nicaragua meets the demands that we are imposing on them. And those demands are two. The Senate passed an amendment, a bill, saying that first, that no aid can go to Nicaragua until they prove to us that they're not involved in terrorism. I mean, we've just carried out the leading, the major terrorist attack in history. It was condemned by the World Court. It was condemned by the United Nations. The only reason it wasn't condemned by the Security Council is because we vetoed it at the Security Council. After this, we're telling them that they have to prove to us that they're not involved in terrorism. Right after that, another amendment came along. It was voted 94-4, meaning virtually unanimous, saying no aid whatsoever until, the way they put it is, you return or compensate for properties of North Americans. That means return Somoza's property. That's what it means. Return the properties owned by the guys who were torturing the country, starving the beasts of burden under this mass murderer Somoza, who the Carter administration, they supported him and his National Guard up through the last minute, to the point where they had killed 40,000 people. They were still supporting them. Say, we got to continue the bombing. Now they got to return properties of those guys. And unless they do that, Senator Dodd tells them they're not going to get any aid. Now, the depravity and the arrogance of this, after what we've done to the country and are doing to it now, it's hard to keep your temper when you put together the facts and the images. And it's not just there. Same when you, maybe it's a shortage of imagination or something, but, it gets me angry enough when I read about it. When you see it, it's very hard to control. So your reaction might be accurate, for all I know.
The follow-up question, maybe it's a moot point now. What are the prospects for the Sandinistas and the Nicaraguan revolution? Elections are coming in '96, yes? Any hope for change?
Well, that's a complex. First of all, I think the Sandinistas have sacrificed a lot of their opportunities for acting as a progressive force. They're not doing anything, as far as I can see, to try to rebuild mass organizations or popular organizations and so on. They're, to the extent that they're doing anything constructive, it's joining up with the sort of moderate wing of the government, the Lacayo wing of the government, to try to pursue a less brutal program and a program of some degree of reconstruction, maybe one with some mild social democratic aspects to it. But they seem completely divorced from the mass organizations, and I don't see any evidence that they're trying to build them. Now, they're there, people are doing things. But from the little I know, I don't think that there's much Sandinista input to it. On the other hand, I'm very skeptical about whether the country can have any meaningful political action. I mean, the last election was a complete joke. The election here, it's called a free election. I mean, the election was run under a very explicit threat. Explicit, no hidden. But unless you vote our way, we're going to continue the terrorist war. That was stated explicitly. Congress voted it, in fact. And we're going to continue the embargo. So you have a free choice. You can vote the way you choose and watch your children starve to death and get killed by a terrorist, or you can vote our way. Well, okay, after that, Anthony Lewis, who you mentioned, was just raving about, we live in a romantic age and we're, Jeffersonian democracy and so on and so forth. The Times had big headlines about victory for U.S. fair play. There was one amazing headline called Americans United in Joy, kind of like Albania. We're all united in joy over the victory for fair play when we got our way by holding a gun to their heads. It's only in a country with really deep totalitarian culture and a total contempt for democracy that you could even talk about this thing. And it was universal here. You couldn't find a criticism of it. And it was quite open. It's not that anybody hid what we did. Say, like you read Time magazine, we thought it was fantastic, and they said that, I wish I could remember the exact words, but they described quite accurately how we won the election. They said first we destroyed the country and we drove the people to starvation, and we gave our candidate a winning issue, namely saving the country from total destruction, and they voted our way, a fantastic victory for democracy. I mean, it sounded like a parody of Nazi Germany or something like that. And that's the way it was across the board. Well, what about the next time around? To have an election that's meaningful, you have to have a functioning society. I mean, it's one of the reasons why our elections are almost meaningless. Each individual is pushing a lever alone. They're not functioning as a political entity. The Aristide election and victory in Haiti was a case of a real election. You had functioning popular organizations. You had a lively, vibrant civil society. People, actually formulating ideas and plans and interests and having a candidate who represented them and pressing for them and so on. Okay, that's an election. You don't have to do it. Certainly not in Nicaragua.
We're getting the EMF.
You getting it again?
Now it's gone.
Yeah, okay. Well, the problem in Nicaragua, I'm not, I don't feel close enough to the country to say with any confidence, but my impression is that civil society is in such disarray and disorganization that the chances of a meaningful election are probably slight. And it's something that we're familiar with because our elections are almost meaningless for exactly the same reason. Here it's a rich country, no state terror, but participation in the elections is a very passive activity. You pick one or another leader and then you go home.
It seems like its hand in everyone's affairs around the world these days. You've mentioned a couple examples of disastrous United States, either covert or implicit intervention: Haiti, Angola, El Salvador, Nicaragua. Have you heard anything about the current conditions in Iraq?
Yeah. The UNICEF just published its 1993 report on the state of children in the world. And it was quite interesting. One of the things was that it described the United States as the worst among the industrial countries. In fact, about twice as bad as the next worst, which I think was England. As far as Iraq was concerned, they said that Iraq has one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world. Now, a couple of years ago, Iraq had quite a very low mortality rate. It was very advanced for an underdeveloped country. But it's shot way up. As by late 1991 already, about 7 or 8 months after the war, a Harvard-based research team estimated about 50,000 Iraqi children had died from the effect of the sanctions after the war. That was almost that's 2 years ago. That was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Since then, it's doubtless hundreds of thousands, children, that is, who have died. The sanctions aren't hurting Saddam Hussein. In fact, they're not intended to. They're intended to punish the Iraqi population, and they understand that. It's not just, I mean, you can say the same about this is the Sunni population in central Iraq. There's also the Kurds in the north and the Shiites in the south. I mean, they're undergoing special punishment. So take the Kurdish areas in the north, who we're supposed to love the Kurds and protect them from Saddam Hussein. In fact, the Bush administration stood by very quietly while Saddam Hussein massacred the Shiites in the south and then the Kurds in the north. And they sort of explained why they were doing it. We needed stability, or as the New York Times mouthpiece for the State Department put it, we needed an iron fist. It couldn't be who would hold Iraq together. It couldn't be Saddam Hussein and some clone. That's what we're after. Well, there was a lot of public uproar about the Kurds, not the Shiites. I think that was mostly racist. The Kurds with their, Aryan features and blue-eyed children and so on, that really got to people. I heard commentary like that on television. Anyway, whatever the reason, there was an uproar about the Kurds, and therefore the U.S. government had to, against its wishes, introduce a kind of an interdiction zone to protect the Kurds from further direct attacks. Well, take a look at what happened after public attention waned. Now nobody's looking at the Kurds anymore. What's happening? Well, what's happening is that the Kurds in the north are now subject to two embargoes. First of all, they're subject to the sanctions against Iraq, and then to sanctions that Saddam Hussein is imposing against them. So a double attack. They don't need much to survive. In fact, the latest UN estimate is they need about $50 million just to enable them to, buy food and plant things and so on. What happened to our love of the Kurds? We can't dig up $50 million, or the entire West can't. In fact, no, the entire West can't dig up anything. They're not even offering them piddling sums. The UN came up with a $500 million proposal for humanitarian aid to Kurds in the north, Shiites in the south, who are even in worse shape, and poor Sunnis, the poor people in central Iraq. They have nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. $500 million. Well, the United States gave $15 million, which was taken out of another program that hadn't been fully spent. In other words, that's the Clinton administration gave zero. That's how much we love the Kurds. So sure, they got to suffer because the same reason the Nicaraguans have to suffer, the same reason the Cubans have to suffer, a reason that any mafia don in New York will explain to you. If somebody on your turf doesn't pay protection when he's supposed to, you don't just give him a black eye. You want to teach an object lesson to other people, so you really torture him properly. Now, these countries, for all different reasons, stood up to the enforcer, and they got to really suffer. Not just ordinary suffering, but real torture. That's Iraq. I should mention, while I'm talking about this UNICEF report, that although I didn't see it reported here, in the there's one major third world journal, English language third world journal, which comes out of Malaysia, and they had an article on the UNICEF report which said Cuba leads all of Latin America, all 22 countries of Latin America, in quality of life for children. That was the result of the UNICEF report, and that's true. They have better infant mortality and so on, better statistics on it than anyone else in Latin America. Well, that's the main reason we're going after Cuba. And in fact, Clinton's harshening the policy over Bush, the Torricelli Amendment, which harshened the embargo against Cuba. They can no longer pretend it's because of the Russians. Obviously, they're not there. This is just now pure torture. The Torricelli Amendment it looked as though Bush was going to veto it, but he was outflanked from the right by Clinton during the campaign and essentially forced to support it. Incidentally, just to show you, Torricelli has a very sensitive concept of democracy, so we have to embargo, we have to make sure that children starve in Cuba because of our love of democracy. But Torricelli was against the embargo in Haiti. The reason was, he said, that Aristide didn't live up to his high standards as a Democrat, and he couldn't see much difference between Aristide and the killers who were going around murdering everyone. So therefore, he was opposed to the embargo in Haiti because, after all, that doesn't meet our standards for democracy. I mean, you think about it for a minute. That tells you what's going on.
I was talking to Murray Bookchin a few days ago, and he said that we need a new left. If that's true, that we need a new left, what do you think a new left would consist of?
I think that I haven't heard any fundamentally new ideas for the last couple hundred years. We need freedom, justice, democracy, participation, breakdown of hierarchic structures, overcoming of domination. We have to see what the structures of power are. They're new. So, for example, transnational corporations have a huge degree of power now that they didn't have 50 years ago, in fact didn't have 20 years ago. So that's a new form of domination. But the principles are about the same, as far as I know. The word, political terminology has been so cheapened, I don't even use words like left anymore, I don't even know what it means. But among the people who are struggling for peace and justice and human rights and so on, there's a vast number of them. What we need is not so much something new as actual organization and a way of articulating concerns and communicating and getting together and so on. It's extremely isolated. I travel a lot. You can go to some city and there can be 6 groups working on the same topic, in different neighborhoods, never heard of each other, Interestingly, in communities that have some degree of central coordination, like maybe a community radio station, it's usually quite different, remarkably different. It happened to be down in Gainesville, Florida, which happens to have a lot of, small community newspapers and radio and that sort of thing, and people know each other. They're working on the same thing. You go to some, like take Boston, they don't know each other because everybody's separate, doing their own little thing, very narrowly focused and so on. These interests and concerns have to not only be articulated but brought together and made constructive, because an awful lot of what ought to be the movement for peace and justice, in my opinion, is frittering away their energy on things which are completely meaningless or pointless, although the commitments are there and the dedication is there. Out of that can come forces for very significant change. In fact, they've already happened. The country's a lot different from what it was 30 years ago, and much more civilized, in fact. But it's just the bare beginning.
One of the key issues of the Christian right and the conservatives is the philosophy of family values. It was a very big thing during the last election, 1992 election. Can you put the isolated family unit, i.e. the father, the mother, the sister, and the brother, in historical perspective? And do you think this encourages human values like selfishness, arrogance, xenophobia, and discourages efforts at collective struggle and a sense of community?
It's kind of like asking, is technology good or bad? Family values can be used to, as they are by the Christian right, in fact, to sponsor xenophobia and fear of others and destructive tendencies, or they can be highly constructive. I mean, a family is where children are first being taught things like sympathy and support and cooperation and so on. And if the family values are such that extends to human beings, it's highly constructive. If it's limited to the family or the tribe or the color or something, it can be very destructive. There's nothing either good or bad about family values. It depends what the family values are. First of all, there's no such thing as family values. There are different family values. One form of family values is we should be for ourselves and against everybody else and try to crush everyone else. That's one kind of family values. Another kind of family values is let's say the father, I'm stronger, I should beat up everyone else and take what I want and keep them under control. That's another kind of family values. Another kind is we're a family, we are a tiny community of sympathy and support, and we realize that that's the way people ought to live. and we're going to work to help other people too. That's another kind of family values. But they're all family values. It depends which ones.
Professor Stephanie Coots wrote a book called The Way We Never Were, and just around the time of the election, she brought up the fact that the nuclear family as an issue is a very recent occurrence in human history, and they attacked her viciously for that. Can you speak about the use of family in terms of community? Is there a dichotomy there?
Well, there's been a lot of research recently on the history of children and families and so on, and in Western society at least, care of children is a fairly recent phenomenon. On the other hand, plenty of other societies have bring children in a very loving and supportive way, including pre-technological, what we call primitive societies. There are many different patterns around the world. I don't think, as far as I know, there's nothing generally you can say about it. Much of the world, in fact, is really based on what we call extended family. So networks of people who are interrelated beyond, father, mother, children. Actually, it's not very far back here. I can remember my own background, immigrant family. Well, the units were extended family. Like a lot of my family lived in one of these railroad apartments in the slum of New York, where you get a long hall and a lot of rooms coming off, and you looked at the different rooms, and this cousin, that brother-in-law, this guy who didn't have any place to sleep, that sort of thing. That was the family. If one part of the family broke down because, the father was a drunkard or couldn't get a job and gave up or left or something, then some other aunt and uncle would pick up the kids and take care of them, and things like that. And you find that all over the world. Take, say, Nicaragua, where it just was. My daughter lives in what we would call an indescribable slum. It's middle class in Nicaragua, but dirt road, dust pouring in the windows, the rain leaking on the crib of her baby, no water. That sort of thing. If you walk down, everything's in the open. For one thing, it's very poor, and for another thing, it's a tropical country. You walk down the street, these little, what would be a big room in a house of ours is a house, and inside it maybe 14 people. And there is usually some kind of family unit there, but all sorts of other things, like some kid they picked off the streets because he was starving, and they brought him in and took care of him, or somebody's friend who didn't have a place to sleep, and that sort of thing. In fact, it's kind of striking when you walk around most of the third world, the parts I've seen, slums of Cairo or Nicaragua or Haiti or places like that, you really don't see the things you see here. Like, you don't stumble over homeless people most of the time, the way you do everywhere here. Well, part of the reason is that there are communities of support. People who've lived under extreme poverty for forever have developed support systems, including complicated arrangements that involve families, but in complex ways, also other things. So they just take care of each other. Here, where poverty is being imposed on people from a rich society, and there isn't the culture of support and development that grew out of it in an organic way, it's something quite different. So you walk down, walk through Harvard Square, and you will trip over homeless people, which you wouldn't in the slums of Cairo.
There's a tendency in the United States to blame the victims. There's an article in Sunday's New York Times about the media. Dan Rather gave a sermon, they call it, about the news, where Dan said that they've got us, the reporters, putting more and more fuzz and was on the air. And the New York Times reporter, Walter Goodman, responds by saying that what makes Mr. Rather's brave denunciation of the commercial television mentality ring hollow is his refusal to utter an unkind word about the brains or taste of the great American audience, those co-conspirators to their own exploitation. Do you have any response to that?
Well, Walter Goodman's a typical commissar, and I use the word advisedly, and that's naturally his point of view. The fact is that people are given highly structured choices, very narrow and highly structured choices, and extremely limited opportunities, and that comes right out of the structure of power, of which someone like Walter Goodman is an apologist, for which he's an apologist. And in that set of structured choices and limited opportunities, people often select options that are self-destructive. That's what happens when people are not in a social situation in which they can act in constructive ways. When they are in such situations and they have such organizations, they behave quite differently. Same people, no different genes. In fact, that audience that he's denouncing is no less capable than he is of high culture, and where societies have functioned. Like, take again my own family. As I say, they were dirt poor, immigrants, unemployed. This is the 1930s. They were immersed in high culture. Budapest String Quartet, Freud, Marx. Well, partly because they were part of an organized working class. There was a live, organized labor movement at the time, and they were part of it, and that was a world. It had its newspapers, it had its... you don't have to go back very far in American society when labor, ethnic, and other newspapers were sort of more or less on the scale of the private capitalist press. And out of that comes a vibrant, living society. In fact, you can see it, say, Haiti right now. Haiti, you can't imagine a poorer society. But what developed through the popular movement was a kind of commitment and dedication and intelligence and understanding and participation that goes way beyond anything that we've got. It's coming out of a society that is so poor you can't even dream about it. And in fact, part of the purpose of the coup and our tacit, sitting behind in the background while the coup takes its toll is to destroy all of this. Make sure that all of that is destroyed. That's not my opinion, in fact. You can read it from, say, America's Watch, who describe what they call the remarkably advanced social organizations in Haiti and the vibrant and lively society and the radio and the newspapers and the meetings and the meetings of illiterate people who think things through and have understanding and ideas and so on. Put people in the same people in other circumstances and give them other choices and eliminate their options, and they will behave in a self-destructive way.